So today we're going to talk about 5.2. So in 5.1, we kind of understood the difference between skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We kind of found out what are the main parts that make up each of them. And in 5.2, we are going to talk about what happens when you have a muscle reacting to a stimulus. So you probably heard of the nervous system a bunch of times. There's something called a neuromuscular system. This is a system that is going to tie in your muscle and your nervous system together. They're going to work together in order for your muscle to actually have movement. So what happens in your neuromuscular system is that this system is actually going to send signals to your skeletal muscle, because remember, your skeletal muscle is what is actually attached to the bones of your body, and these signals are going to be released in something called the neuromuscular junction. And as they're released into this neuromuscular junction, this is going to trigger your skeletal muscle to move. So let's talk about the neuromuscular junction. So first of all, your neuromuscular junction is part of being voluntarily controlled, because your skeletal muscle is under voluntary controlment. So you can actually have the ability to move your muscles whenever you want when it comes to skeletal muscles. And that's going to help you, be able to move your muscles. So the neuromuscular junction, it has a couple components. One, obviously, it has a neuron, the neuro part of neuromuscular junction. And this neuron is actually really, really important, because this is what is going to stimulate your muscle in order for it to move. And then it also has a motor unit. This is basically a neuron, the motor neuron, and also all of the muscles that it's going to stimulate in order to cause a reaction. And so the motor unit is also known as a functional unit of the neuromuscular system. So you can kind of see in this diagram here that you have your spinal cord that's coming from your vertebrae, and it's connected through a bunch of neurons that are then connected to your muscle fibers that make up your muscle. And we will talk about specifically each parts of these and how they trigger your muscle to move. So, your motor unit can have small muscles, and it can also have large muscles. The smaller muscles obviously are going to have smaller motor units, meaning they have smaller motor neurons and smaller muscles that they actually stimulate to work. And so they're going to control muscles in your body that have very fine movement. So this can be your eyes, your fingers, things that are not going to make drastic movements, but you're able to use them for picking up little things, texting, or things that don't require a lot of stimulation. Then you have large muscles that also make up your body, and these contain a lot more fibers, and they have a large amounts of motor units. The motor unit itself is going to be bigger because they're involved in larger movements. And so this is going to be walking, running, kicking, movement of your hips, movement of your trunk. So these muscles are actually, these muscles are actually going to connect with, they can either be located in one specific area of your body. So your trunk muscles are specific to your trunk, but there can also be ability for them to attach to other parts of your body, because parts of your trunk muscles are going to be connected to your neck muscles or your leg muscles, and so on and so forth. An important part of muscle movement has to do with action potentials. Action potentials are almost like signals that travel through your neurons, through your muscles, in order for the communication to be had and in order for muscle movement to occur. Okay, so how does a motor neuron communicate with the muscle cells in the motor unit? First of all, we have to understand what is a neuron made up of. So a neuron has a couple parts to it. It has something called the cell body. It has something called an axon. And then it also has something called the axon terminals, which attaches to the actual muscle. So if we look at this picture again, you can tell that the cell body is what is actually connecting to the spinal cord. It has something called dendrites, which receive information. And then it's going to send an action potential down the axons, which are right here. Those axons will then take those messages and the stimulus to their axon terminals. The axon terminals is what is going to actually attach to a muscle fiber, and those individual muscle fibers are then what are going to cause the movement for the entire muscle in itself. And so when this is happening, this is how your muscles are actually reacting. There are also other components like certain chemicals that get released that we'll talk about, but mainly you have this kind of attachment of these neurons that are really connecting your spinal cord to your muscle fibers in order to have a reaction occurring. And between the axon terminal and the actual muscle fiber, that is where your neuromuscular junction is going to be. And that's where you are going to have the release of certain chemicals that occur, that allow a stimulus to travel down your muscles. So, neuromuscular junction. So what happens here? Well, first of all, the neuromuscular junction, like I said, is a space that you have between the neuron itself and the muscle fiber that it's connecting to. And this space has a specific name. This space is called the synaptic cleft. So within the neuromuscular junction, you have this synaptic cleft, and this is going to be, so in this area, you don't really have your axon terminal directly interacting with the muscle fiber. What you actually have is a small gap where you have an exchange of chemicals occurring that are going to trigger your muscle fiber to move. And so when you look at this picture, you can kind of see there is a bunch of things happening. You have these tiny vesicles that are forming, that are releasing certain chemicals that will then go into the muscle fiber to cause a reaction, which will then cause a stimulus. So we're going to get into that and talk about that. So what happens in the neuromuscular junction? When the nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon terminal, you are going to have a chemical called a neurotransmitter that is going to be released. The specific name of the neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, also short, abbreviated with capital AC and then lowercase h. So what happens is the axon, which is kind of like the middle part that connects your cell body or the neuron cell body to the axon terminal, it's going to carry these neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. So we saw the synaptic cleft in the previous slide. And the axon terminal is going to release these neurotransmitters onto these receptors that are located on the muscle fiber. So if I go back here, you can see that the yellow picture, the yellow diagram is the axon terminal. And it has these little blue vesicles inside that are filled with acetylcholine, or the neurotransmitter. Those vesicles will fuse with the end of the axon terminal, release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. Those acetylcholines will attach to receptors on the muscle fiber, which is what you see is that whole red diagram going on there. And once they attach to those receptors, you are going to have a reaction occur. When the acetylcholine gets to the axon terminal at the end of the neuron, we said that it gets released from the vesicles so that it can go into the synaptic cleft, and it can attach to the receptor on the muscle fiber. So what happens exactly is that when the acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft and gets attached to the receptors of the muscle cells, it actually causes a reaction in the sarcolemma by making it really permeable, just temporarily though. And when this sarcolemma is temporarily permeable, remember, sarcolemma we said was the, in 5.1, it's like the outer covering for the muscle fiber. And so when it makes it temporarily permeable, you have two things occurring. One, you have the ability for sodium ions to come into the cell, and then you have potassium ions that are going to be able to flow out of the cell. All right. You do have a lot more of the sodium channels than the potassium channels on the actual sarcolemma, and therefore the inside of the cell is going to have a positive charge compared to the outside of the cell. So if we look at this picture, you can see the acetylcholine vesicles in the blue, which is representing the axon terminal. It's being released from the vesicles as it merges to the end. The vesicles, they combine with the membrane of the axon terminal, releasing the acetylcholine. The acetylcholine will then attach to receptors on the muscle fiber. And then what happens is this acetylcholine causes the sarcolemma to become more permeable. Therefore, you have the ability for sodiums to come in and potassiums to be released. And then you can see that, there's going to be more of a positive charge than a negative charge that is occurring in this situation. Now, there's something called depolarization. Depolarization is when you have sodium ions entering, potassium ions exiting. Therefore, you are having this positive charge inside of the muscle fiber. So when we talked about this change in ions leaving and coming in, creating this positive charge inside of the cell, this is what depolarization is. So depolarization is also what triggers the opening of an excess amount of sodium channels, only sodium channels though. And so when you have all of these sodium ions coming in, or sodium channels opening, allowing sodium ions to come in, now you have a bunch of positive ions that are coming into the muscle cell. And so now that positive charge actually causes an electrical charge called an action potential. All right, so depolarization, which is a bunch of sodium channels opening, sodium rushing into the cell, making the cell or the muscle cell or muscle fiber becomes a lot more positive. Therefore, you have an action potential being created. Action potential is what is represented by the abbreviation AP. So this is kind of a graph that you will see a lot when we talk about action potentials. You can see where depolarization is, which is basically, as it says, the opening of sodium channels. And then after depolarization, we are going to get into something called repolarization. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so now that your sarcomeres, which are an important part of your muscle fiber, are stimulated, they are going to cause contraction. So contraction is, when this happens, when you have contraction happening, you have a lot of glycogen that's actually being stored in different parts of your body, one of them being your liver. Glycogen is when you just have extra like sugar, starch being, they need a place to be stored. So when you have a contraction, glycogen that's in your liver, excuse my laundry, it actually gets broken down into glucose. So when they start to get broken down into glucose, glucose is going to go through the process of cellular respiration. And in cellular respiration, glucose molecules get broken down in order to make ATP. ATP is the energy that our body uses in order for any kind of function to happen. And so when you have ATP being made in the mitochondria, that is going to be used in order to trigger action potentials. These action potentials are what are causing your muscle cells to move. Now, there is something called a phosphocreatine, which is going to be inside the cell, and this is going to allow the transfer of energy to a protein, to protein filaments called actin and myosin in the sarcomere itself. So I'm going to say that again. Phosphocreatine, which is, as it says here, takes the ATP and transfer it to the sarcomere so that it can contract. What it's specifically doing is that inside of the sarcomere, there are two specific kinds of proteins. You have your actin and you have your myosin. That is what is going to get energy that is going to be transferred from the phosphocreatine, and that energy is going to come in the form of ATP. ATP is going to interact, like I said, with actin and myosin, which are protein filaments. And then also while this interaction is happening, during a contraction, you are also going to have a input of calcium ions that are going to come into the cell. And this is going to cause actin and myosin to interact. And the way that they interact is that the actin actually is going to slide over the myosin to create this contraction kind of look. So let's go through the steps of contraction. The first thing that you see, step 1 right here, is that the myosin is actually going to have something called heads. And they're going to hydrolyze ATP so that it can provide the energy that it needs for the muscle contraction. So the myosin heads are going to attach to the actin. The actin is shown in the yellow. Myosin heads, you can see, is in the red. So the myosin head will attach to the actin when you have an action potential being stimulated. And this is what is going to activate the sarcomere to actually contract. So that is step 1. In step 2, when you have this connection between the myosin head and the actin filament, remember the actin filament is what you see in yellow, you are going to create something called a cross bridge. Cross bridge is simply the myosin head attaching to the actin. Then, in the third step, the sarcomere is going to contract because of this interaction between the myosin head and the actin, and it's going to pull the actin filament towards the center many times as you have this contraction occurring. It kind of looks like a rowing, like if you've ever seen somebody row, it's that mechanical kind of stimulation that keeps occurring. So you're going to have these heads pull these actin filaments towards the center and then keep pulling them in that same direction when you have a contraction happening. Now, when we talked about the calcium ions that come in that help with the trigger of action potentials, the reason calcium ions are very important is because they actually are the ones that are allowing the attachment of the myosin heads to the actin. So the reason that if you look in this key right here, the calcium ions are those like purple dots. You can see those purple spheres are attached to parts of the actin. That is what is allowing these myosin heads to actually attach to the actin in order for the contraction to occur. That's why it's important for calcium release when you have action potentials occurring. So this is just a picture. You can see the myosin, the actin, you can see the heads, and then you can see like the different parts that make, so both of these are made up in the sarcomere. All right, action potential and contraction. The neuromuscular system can make slow, gentle movements, or they can make really fast and forceful ones. So if you have a small movement, that means you have a small number of action potentials that are occurring. So you're going to have slow and gentle movements like blinking, maybe just petting your dogs, like slow, very small movements, or picking up something. When you have a large number of action potentials, though, you are going to have fast or forceful movements. And then the different kinds of movements, whether they're small or large, are going to depend on the number and frequency of the action potential that you actually have. Okay, now we're going to talk about tension and relaxation. When we talk about tension, it's also known as an all or none law. Basically, when you receive an action potential, a specific motor unit will always develop a maximum amount of tension. When you have this occurring in tension, you have muscles that have multiple motor units. Because each whole muscle has multiple motor units, the units, you're going to have a simultaneous activation of many motor units in order to have a muscle react to and get to the point of maximum tension. So in order to receive maximum tension, you're going to need a lot of motor units working together in order to get to that point. There is something called tetanus, which is when you have a high frequency stimulation that the muscle will develop and you will reach maximum tension. And this can be this is not a good thing. This can be due to a bacterial infection that has really bad muscle spasms, and it can actually lead to death. And, that's one of the reasons that you have to be careful when you are working with things that are rusty or metallic, like a tetanus shot. They give you a tetanus shot so that you don't have your muscles cramping and spazzing out because of some kind of bacterial infection that can, dangerously create your muscles to have a high amount of tension in it. So relaxation is what's going to come after your action potential. So your muscle, is going through this stimulus. You have this action potential that triggers the muscle movement, and now your muscle is super tense, right? Because you're doing an activity or whatever. After that, you have to hit a point of relaxation. So this is when your muscle is going to start to kind of come down to back to its normal levels. So it's going to, usually when you have a muscle and it reaches tension, it's going to have something called a muscle twitch. After that happens, you have relaxation hit. And what they usually say is that after you have an action potential and it travels all the way down the axon into the muscle fiber, you're going to have a bunch of chemical processes that are going to occur that we're going to talk about that is going to help the muscle fiber return back to its resting stage. So what are these chemical processes that's happening in order for your muscle to return back to its resting stage? One, you're going to have sodium ions that once came into the cell to make it positive to trigger an action potential, but when you have relaxation, those sodium ions are going to leave the cell. The calcium ions that came with action potential to help contraction in the sarcolemma is going to go back into storage until you have the next contraction. And then the cross bridges that were formed when you had the myosin heads attached to the actin filaments are going to release so that the actin filaments can go back to their original position, as well as the myosin heads. So, step 1, I'm going to say it again. When you have relaxation after you've had an action potential, you're going to develop twitches in the muscle to get the maximum amount of tension, and it's going to be brief. And then your muscle is going to go back into a relaxing stage. And you're going to have some chemicals that are going to be released in order for this to happen, such as sodium ions are going to leave the cell, calciums are going to return back to their storage until obviously the next contraction. You're going to have the myosin heads and the actin filaments detach, and you are going to have them return back to their original shape. So, in review, an action potential, number 1, an action potential causes 1/2 of the fibers in the motor unit to contract. True or false? That's false. Number 2, acetylcholine crosses the synaptic cleft at the neuromuscular junction. That is true. The sarcomeres lengthen by myosin filaments sliding over actin filaments. That's false. It's the opposite. The actin filaments will slide over the myosin filaments because the myosin filaments have the heads that pull these actin filaments. Now, continuing with skeletal fibers, there's actually 2 types of categories when we talk about skeletal fiber types. There's one that's called a slow twitch. This is type 1. And then there's one that's called fast twitch, right? Which is type 2A and type 2B. Slow twitch, which is type 1, this is what causes a slow contraction of your muscles. So this is what people develop when they're preparing for a marathon, triathlons, when they have trying to, do a long hike or something like that. They want to develop their muscles to not use up all of their energy at once, but rather over a long period of time. They're trying to build endurance, okay? So you can see in this picture, like a slow twitch type 1 would be like a long distance runner compared to people who are with short sprints or, 400 meters / 800 meter run, which is which you need a lot more energy in a shorter period of time. When we talk about fast twitch, this is the type 2. So you have a faster amount of contraction. It's going to contract a lot faster than your slow twitch. And there's 2 types of type 2. You have type 2A and type 2B. This is really good. Fast twitch is really good for sprinters because you need a lot more energy in a shorter amount of time. So when you talk about type 2A, this is going to be your intermediate. So this is going to be somewhere between a slow and a fast twitch fibers. And then when you talk about type 2B, this is going to contract 1/7 the time required for the slow twitch to contract. So this is going to be like, you are going to contract fast, but then you're also going to fatigue rapidly. So most skeletal muscles have motor units with both slow and fast twitch fibers, but it also depends on what type of muscle and what type of person you are. Like if you're athletic, if you're used to the training, if you're not, so on and so forth. So again, type 1, slow twitch, you are able to have more endurance. You can last a longer amount of time. Type 2A and type 2B, you are going to, type 2A is between type 1 and 2B, so you don't get as tired as fast as you would if you were in type 2B. But, they're both considered fast twitch, meaning you have a fast amount of contraction happening. Okay, there's 2 types of architectural designs that your skeletal muscles fibers are arranged in. One of them is called parallel and one of them is called pennate. Your parallel fibers look like this, okay? You can kind of see the way that they're running. They have a couple characteristics. So they're going to run parallel along the length of the muscle, as we can see in the picture. They have interconnections between them and their neighbors so that each of them, so that they all kind of move in unison and then they're not going, their own way, I guess. They all contract simultaneously. They allow shortening of the muscles and which allows them to move through a long range of motion. And they have something in the next slide I'm going to show you. There's a couple different types that go with parallel fibers. You have something called fusiform. An example of this would be your biceps brachii. Basically, this means you have a wide part in the middle, and then it kind of like slims down or closes down on both ends. So you can see that this is your fusiform. It's thicker in the middle and more narrow at the end. Bundled is like the one picture that you see in the middle right here. This is an example would be your rectus abdominis, which is in your abdomen area. You can see that the bundled because they kind of are sectionated. And then you have triangular, which is your pectoralis major, known as your pecs. And these are more of a triangular shape. The other type of architecture that we have for skeletal muscle is your pennate. These are when you have fibers that are going to attach, they call it obliquely, to a central tendon, which just obliquely just means it's like tilted or slanted. And they attach to a central tendon. They can also attach to more than one tendon as well. So this is going to allow more fibers to pack into the muscle, have a larger amount of force. Because they are more packed and they have more force, these are usually in areas, they're able to endure a lot more. There are a couple different types of pennate fibers. You have unipennate, which is just them moving in one direction. This would be, example would be your hand muscles. Unipennate are lined with a central tendon. Then you have bipennate, which is two directions that the fibers are aligned in. Example is your rectus femoris. And then this is going to be, the rectus femoris is just the superior anterior part of your thigh. So the top front part of your thigh. And then you have your multipennate, which is more than two directions that the fibers are aligned in. And this is your deltoid muscle, which is in your shoulder. An example of that would be your deltoid muscle. Okay, so muscular strength. You get muscular strength because of some kind of external pressure like you're exercising. So we measure how much muscular strength you have by how much resistance you can actually move. When you measure muscular strength, you measure a lot of muscles at once. This is going to be established by torque, which gives you a more precise assessment of the strength that you are able to have. So muscular torque is when you have a muscle that generates, or I should say, when you have a torque, basically torque is the assessment of the strength of a muscle group at a given joint. You can refer this as torque or a rotary force that the muscle can actually generate. So the more torque a muscle can generate at a joint, the greater tendency for movement of the bones of that joint. Then you also have something called muscle power, which utilizes speed. So muscle power uses speed, which will equal force times velocity. A little bit of math here. And then when you calculate force, you're talking about the muscle force. When you're talking about velocity, you're saying the muscle shortening that you have during a contraction. When you have muscle power, you're not just usually calculating it for one muscle. You're calculating it for a bunch of different muscles and how they work together. So in muscle power, you would be calculating during sprinting or jumping or throwing and things like that. Then you have something called muscle endurance, which produces tension in muscle over a period of time. So you can either have it constant or be varied. When you have a varied, you're running. It would be like you're running, you're riding your bike, you're rowing. If you have a constant Muscle endurance, this is like your gymnast holding their position, right? So varied is like you kind of change over a period of time, and then like, you know, a kind of a repetitive motion, but it's changing. Constant is like when you are literally holding a position. Longer the physical activity obviously means you have more muscle endurance, and it's specific to whatever activity you are doing because the force and speed for that activity is going to be different. Muscle fatigue is going to be the opposite to muscle endurance. So the faster muscle fatigues is going to equal that you're going to have lesser endurance. So faster muscle fatigue, less endurance it has. So when you talk about muscle strength, you're talking about torque. Remember, torque is produced by muscle. Torque produced by muscle is basically the product of the muscle force and also the perpendicular distance from where that muscle is attached to the center of that muscle's rotation. If you look on page 169, it does a phenomenal job of explaining it. This is, you know, it's a little bit more physics in this part than it is just anatomy. When you talk about muscle power, you're talking about speed. And then when you talk about muscle endurance, you're talking about tension. All right, so let's work on this review for this section. So if you have force times velocity, what does that mean? That refers to your muscle power, okay? When you have muscle tension over time, you are talking about muscle endurance. Remember, there's varied and constant. More muscle endurance when you have more. It would be constant if you're holding a position versus varied if you are repeating a position or movement. Rotary force that muscles can produce at a joint is called muscle strength. We talked about two types of skeletal fibers that can either do a slow twitch, which means you have a slow amount of fatigue, like marathon runners. You have more endurance, and then you have fast twitch, which is you fatigue faster. So the faster and more heavier you have of a movement that's quickly done, you are going to fatigue from it a lot faster. So that's it for section 5.2. Make sure that you study all of this material. It's a lot of stuff, I know, so that you can be ready for your quiz and your test.